All right, welcome back. Welcome back. A little light attendance today. It's raining? Is that a reason to miss class? It's raining? It's not a reason. Your midterm is next week. Yeah. Did you all get your exam numbers from the registrar?
Wait, is that the email from this early?
Oh, one at a time. So this early, this is class 13.
No, I mean the exam numbers.
Your exam number for the midterm is different than your exam number for the final. So just one person, raise your hand. Did you get your midterm exam numbers?
No.
Thank you. Okay, could one of you, you all right? All right, could one of you just stop by the registrar's office at some point between now and ask when you're going to get it? I find that when you do it, it's more effective when I do it. Just one of you, not all at once. You can do it.
I have a question. I'm not volunteering.
Yeah.
We did get an email from Exemplify.
That's the start.
That's your exam.
Yeah, and you have to sign up for that, and they'll give you a special number. Now, let me just explain how this works.
So if we haven't signed up for that, then we won't have received the number?
Yes.
Oh, then that's probably why.
So none of you actually did what the email said. God bless you. Okay, that's fine. Can some of you, so at least one of you do it before class on Wednesday so I can get this straightened out. So the reason why is we get a different exam number for your final and your midterm. That way I can see who you are and I can help you. I can counsel you. If you have blind grading, it doesn't really help you very much for the midterm. Okay? Just do it after class. Just worry about it later. Okay. But I encourage you, your Langdell's on Saturday. Is that right? This Saturday, right? Go to see Arlene. She's very good. She'll help you. If you don't see her beforehand, you're only hurting yourself. I would also encourage you, and I strongly encourage you, to take one of my old exams under time before the exam. There are things you have to realize. There's a 90-minute time limit. That's important. There's a 1,000 word limit. Right? Let me explain the word limit. Any brief you ever file in any court, in any jurisdiction, you have a word limit or a page limit. Without question, writing to the point is a very important skill. And the reason why it's an important skill on an exam is you can't BS me. I know how people like to write their exams. They just write everything they can think of. They just dump their outlines, hoping that they hit something that's actually on point. That will not work with me, my friends. So let me give you a brief overview how the exam works. There are two types of exam questions I can ask you. Two types. The first type is set in the present day, 2018, based on all the law and everything we know today. The second type of question I can ask you is based on some point in the past, where I might say the year is 1868. The year is 1791. The year is 1787. And you can only use the cases that have been decided up to that point in time. The reason why I test you in this fashion is to get you thinking of how law develops. If I just say, what's the law today, you don't get the tradition and how it moved. Okay, why is this important? I'll tell you in advance what your midterm is. It can be a present day question or it can be an old question, and I won't tell you. I haven't written it yet, so I have no idea. I usually don't write it till very close in time so I don't inadvertently give it away because I have a bad habit of doing that. So it might be an old question, might be a new question. Okay, the second thing you have to keep in mind is your time limit. You have 90 minutes. You have a fact pattern, maybe a page to 2 pages in length, followed by 5 questions. Right? You have a fact pattern followed by 5 questions. And you have 1,000 words total. If you do some simple math, that means roughly 200 words for each of the 5 questions. Right? So you have 90 minutes to do 5 questions, roughly 200 words each. My recommendation, spend at least 20 to 30 minutes reading the question very carefully. This is not just for my exam, but all exams. The more time you spend reading and outlining before you start writing your exam, the less likely you're going to go in the wrong direction. And the biggest mistake students make is they go the wrong direction and they scramble and just put garbage in the paper because they ran out of time. So take your time. Give yourself 20 minutes to read the question twice if you can. Okay, read the question twice if you can. In fact, what I would suggest you even do is when you first get the exam, jump ahead to the questions. Read the questions first. Read the questions first. That gives you a frame of what I'm asking about. Then go back and read the fact pattern. You don't have to, but I recommend you do that. So you read the questions, you read the fact pattern twice, give it a really good read, then you start writing. So again, you're going to have 5 questions, each one roughly 200 words. If you don't know how to use the word count feature in ExamSoft, go ask the registrar. Right? It's somewhat hidden. It's like under tools. It's not obvious. One other point. Do not do a character count. Everyone know what a character versus a word is, right? A character is a letter. Right? For example, a text message is roughly 150 characters, right? A tweet used to be 140 characters. Every year, one student does 1,000 characters. That's like 3 sentences. You're laughing. People have failed the midterm because of that. Don't laugh. Someone in the class will probably do it. They'll panic. 1,000 words, not 1,000 characters. If you can't figure out how to use the character or the word count feature in the software, use your finger. It takes 30 seconds to count. Okay? If you want to handwrite, I suggest you don't. Don't. You're handicapping yourself. And eventually, in 2 years, so you all take the bar exam. There's no reason why you should be taking the bar exam on paper. There isn't. You're hurting yourself in ways you don't understand. So train. And the way you train is as a second-year law student. Start getting acclimated to typing an exam. My brain doesn't think that way. Okay, you're going to have to write on a computer for the rest of your life. Okay, as an attorney, you'll be typing for the rest of your life. Deal. I'm sorry. If you want to handwrite and you insist, that's fine. I can't stop you. There'll be blue books available for you to handwrite. But you're hurting yourself. And the reason why is you have to edit. Right? You may write something and come back 20 minutes later and realize, oh, no, that's wrong. So you have to start crossing out and entering in zigzag lines, and it makes my life very difficult, and it's not helping you. So learn to type, take a class, use this as a sample, okay? But you need to know how to type an exam. You're really not you're not doing any favors. The exam itself, I will give you a grade. A, B+, B-, whatever, but ultimately it's a pass-fail, right? If you fail the exam, I reserve the right to decrease your participation score by a third. Right? That's it's a penalty. I don't always fail someone. Maybe sometimes I fail one person, maybe 2. But here's how you automatically fail. You don't show up. Right? So if you have some sort of conflict, you need to talk about this in advance. I can work something out with you. But if you just don't show up, you failed. Don't show up late. That's a fail. Right? If you show up late to the bar, they don't let you in the front door. You can't just walk in midstream. It's distracting to your classmates. It's very unfortunate people do that. So you have a class beforehand, so I don't think tardiness will be an issue. But get here on time, please. What else? All the old exams are on the syllabus. They're all linked. Before your exam, a week from Wednesday, take one of the old midterms under time. Take 90 minutes and go to the library and try and take it. You will learn more from that 90 minutes than going over your notes. And why do I use scare quotes? The number one way people study is by going over their notes. That doesn't mean anything, right? You don't learn anything by reading your notes. You learn something by writing and doing. I can give you a mountain this high of studies showing going over your notes does absolutely nothing for you. How do I know this? I will meet with every one of you after the midterm. We'll schedule times. It's going to be on a weekend. I'm sorry. You're here. I'm here. And I will talk to you, and I will ask you one question. How did you study for the exam? Maybe you say, I went over my notes, but you didn't study. I'll ask you, did you take a sample midterm from last year? And you'll say, no, I didn't. Like, okay, that's why you got a bad score. So please take 90 minutes between now and next week and go over one of my old midterms. It's possible that maybe there's a topic that I didn't teach the same way, and maybe I didn't teach a case. I've modified the syllabus over years. It doesn't even matter if you know all the stuff in the exam. The act of taking it and struggling through for 90 minutes will show you what I'm trying to ask you. It's like the Matrix. I can't tell you what the exam is, right? You can't just look at the exam. Like, it's a piece of paper. It's like this holy grail. You got to try and struggle with it for 90 minutes. So if you can all give me 90 minutes between now and next Wednesday, you will all be in a much better place for the midterm. Also, go to Arlene's Langdell session this weekend. She got an A in my class, very bright student. She was a teacher in a former career. She'll give you some tips of what I'm looking for, right? But I'm not that creative. If you look at my old exams, I have the old A+ answers. I have some memos available for you to read, but actually try and take it first. Don't just like look at it, try and take the midterm. Okay? This is for your advantage, and it's a lot of extra work for us, but we think it's a worthwhile endeavor for students. But if you blow up the midterm, then I hate to break it to you, but generally the scores you get in the midterm is your final exam score. There's very little movement. Some people move up, some people move down, but most people are within a range. Whatever they get in the midterm, that's their score. So show yourself how you can do in the midterm, and that will probably dictate where you wind up at the end of the semester. Oh, the onslaught of questions, yeah. Okay, Dusty, then Jesse.
Will the conditions for the midterm be the same as the exam where we're able to use the notes?
Completely open book, whatever you want. It's got to be printed, though. You can't look at your laptop.
Right.
It will not help you, though. I mean that sincerely. If you find yourself flipping through your notes during the exam, you're probably wasting time. The only thing you should probably check is like if you forget what year a case was decided, or maybe you forget the name of a justice who decided a case, or maybe like you forgot like, you know, it's like, oh, what was that case with the butchers? Oh yeah, Slaughterhouse. You can check your notes, right? That's about it. If you're flipping through a case book, you're not in good shape. You're probably gonna run out of time. The reason why you can have an open book test or a closed book, right? If it's closed book, you can ask simple memorization questions I don't particularly care for. But open book is whatever you want will not help you. Jesse and then Janice, yeah.
If you, this is about the exam number. If you download Examplify, whatever it's called,
Yeah.
it already has your number in there, so you don't have to do any research to get your number.
Ah, everyone heard what she just said?
You're good. Just download it and you're good.
Okay, so I think Jesse's right about this. They change the software every year to.
Just did it.
Damn straight. Okay, Jesse's right about this. Again, I haven't checked it myself, but I will take her word for it.
She's right.
Okay, we got confirmation. Okay, very good. So if you download the software, it gives you your number. Make sure you hold on to that number. Write it down somewhere, please. Because when you want to pick up your exam, you're going to need to know what your number is. Right? I don't want to know your name and your number. I don't want that mixed until they're graded fully. Okay, but thank you, Jesse. Janice, I think your hand was up a minute ago?
So in terms of coverage, so is it going to cover everything
Up until Monday.
the class?
Yep, up until Monday. Whatever we cover Monday's fair game. Again, I haven't written it yet. I'm probably not going to write till Monday night or Tuesday because I have this terrible habit of like giving stuff away. It's just really bad. I can't play cards. I would be really bad at playing cards. I can't bluff. Okay, what else? Other questions? But yeah, please, this weekend, take 90 minutes, put it on your calendar. I know you're all so busy, but if you do this 90 minutes, it'll be a heck of a lot better than studying over your notes. I'm sorry? 200 words is about 4 or 5 sentences, maybe 6 sentences. That's what 200 words looks like. So you have to basically cut to the chase. And if I could make this point a little bit more bluntly, you learn in legal writing the IRAC, I-R-A-C, right? I just want the A.
Okay, I'm glad you said that. Okay.
That was helpful.
I'm glad you said that.
The legal writing professors don't like when I say that, but I say it every semester. Just cut to the analysis. Just cut to the analysis. I know what the facts are. I wrote the question. I mean, yeah. I'm sorry, Mia?
But cite, right?
You have to cite cases, right? Yeah. I mean, I don't need full citations. Don't need Blue Book. I don't need, you know, the this be that. A one-word case, you know, Dred Scott, you know, Slaughterhouse, you know, Bradwell. I'll know what you're talking about. Yeah, Kyle.
Can you give us any idea of like how you distinguish an A answer from a B answer? Are there designated points per rule?
Yeah, okay, so.
You only post a good answer.
So I post the A+ answer, right? So that's a good answer. But let me try and break it down a little bit. So there are 5 questions on each midterm, right? Basically, the midterm is half of the final. So the midterm is 90 minutes with 5 questions. The final has 2 parts, 5 and 5, so 10 questions total. Of the 5 questions, the 5th one is what I call the policy question, right? It addresses a broader issue about how the court's developed, how law has come to be, different competing interests. It's more of a policy question, something specific. So always make sure you budget time for the policy question. And the policy question, I think, is strongest when it incorporates things we've discussed in class about the cases. The mere fact that it's a policy question doesn't mean you forget about the fact that the Supreme Court does stuff. So the policy question should always bring in cases in the manner in which we've discussed them in class, if that makes sense. Much of our discussion is not about doctrine, but just about, policy. Why did Tawney do the things he did the way he did, right? Those sorts of things. I'm just picking something recently we did last class, but those sorts of things can be addressed in the outline of cases. Now, what makes a good question for a bad question? There are 5 questions. Each question is graded on a scale of 1 to 10. So a perfect score is 50. On the final, perfect score is 100. So that just gives you a sense of where you are. I've never given a 100 on an exam before in ConLaw. Maybe in property once, never in ConLaw. Usually the A paper gets maybe a 92. The A plus paper is like a 92. The cutoff for a B is usually in the high 30s. So yeah, no, 30 out of 50.
Oh, okay.
I mathed it. No. So out of 50, yeah, okay, I'll keep it simple. I'm sorry. Out of 50, the A plus paper is usually around a 42 or 43, maybe 44, sometimes 45. But that's usually the A plus paper for the midterm. The cutoff for a B is probably between a B and a B plus, maybe 37. And then it goes down from there. So what makes an A from a B? What I look for primarily is a discussion of cases. Okay? What do I mean by that? You need to know all the cases well. It's not enough for you to simply give me whatever rule you think there is about the Commerce Clause. You have to tell me what case said that rule. And that simple fact of giving me rules with cases bumps you up to the 8 to the 9 region. I get very few 10s. That's an 8 to a 9 region. If you merely give me the rule without any sort of case discussion, 6 or 7 points. If you fail to give me a correct rule, but you give me some rule that maybe is in the ballpark, 4 to 5 points. And if you completely bomb it, 3 points, 2 points. So the upper end of the curve, so to speak, is people who can articulate the accurate rule given the cases we've discussed. And what I really like to see is people who can explain why a rule may or may not apply to a given case. What do I mean by that? When I write the fact patterns for the exam, I'll take something that we studied and I'll twist it around. And I'll rearrange the facts and line the parties up differently in such a way that maybe the way the court reasoned doesn't apply to this case, but it comes out a little bit differently, which makes you understand what the court's analysis was, not just giving the black letter holding. Right? It's not just enough to say, Lopez said this and this. Well, what if the gun had traveled in interstate commerce? How would it come out? So it's going to be something you're familiar with, but twisted in a way that you haven't quite seen before. And that's how I can distinguish people who are simply cramming a commercial outline, which will not help you, and students who actually have internalized and embraced the reasonings of different justices. Also, we have dissents, and that actually helps. You have to understand maybe there's a reason, maybe sometimes a dissent raises a point the majority ignored, and the question actually falls to one of the dissents. One other point that's worth addressing, if the question says the year is 1868, the quickest way to blow your exam up is by citing recent cases. Happens every year. People panic, they don't know what to do. You're better off not citing recent cases than doing that. Just don't cite, pay very close attention. The first sentence is the year is blank. And your outline should have some sort of chronological sorting of the cases and just draw a red line, right? Like BB style, right? Just draw a red line. Do not go beyond that red line. Was that it? Yeah, Andrew?
If you say it's 1850 and Like, how
I'll try not to do that like that, but if I do, it'll be obvious what the answer is. In other words, the casebook doesn't give you the month the case was decided. I think there might be a couple months mentioned, so I'm not going to rely on you on what month the case was decided. So I think you assume it's December 31st of that year, if that makes your life easier. Yeah, Mia?
So I know you said you don't want IRAC, but like if we say direct effects, do we need to explain that?
So her question was about IRAC and direct effects. Well, I think the way you would write that, and take a look at the A+ answer to be sure, but you can say,
Like, do we need to tell you that we know what it is, basically?
well, I think you can do it in one step. You can say, under the rule in Wickard, for example, this local economic activity does substantially affect interstate commerce, and therefore it falls within the scope of Congress's commerce necessary and proper powers, right? In other words, you don't need to just state the rule in the abstract. You would apply it to the given case, which is why I skip to the A. Make sense?
The concern is the word count.
Which is why you have to practice. You got to practice, and this is why I'm telling you, try writing it out for 1,000 words. Using Word, Microsoft Word, don't need to use the software, but just test yourself, and you will see in 90 minutes what it means to do a 1,000-word essay. If you walk in raw or walk in blind to the exam, you're not going to finish. You're not going to finish, and I can't help you then. I mean, I can help you, but you got to help yourself a little bit. But please look at the syllabus, look at the old exams, look at the A+ answers, take it in the exam, and just internalize what I'm looking for, and then you'll be in a much better place. Yeah, I have to give the same spiel to my property students on Wednesday. I forgot to do it today, so you're getting it now. Yeah, Monica.
I'm sorry if you already answered this. How soon will we get or those appointments set up after the midterm?
I don't know when. Hold on. I plan to do the exam reviews. This is tentative. When the heck am I going to do these? It's gonna be for you on a weekend, unfortunately. Probably the weekend of. It's gonna be November, because I do need time to actually grade these things. So I think November 4th is a Sunday, and November 11th, which is also a Sunday. I think I'll get your entire class in those 2 days. What I usually do is I come in at 8 in the morning, and I stay till 8 p.m. So it makes it here all day. I also have my property students, because they're day students, they're a little more flexible. I'm going to see them at night. You're in class at night, and I'll reserve my weekends for you. So I think those are the 2 days I blocked off for the reviews. I don't know when I'll set the dates, but those are going to be the days.
So for people like who already have like Sunday set aside for something else, is there any Saturday or?
I'm usually not here on Saturdays, but there'll be a night slot. One night after class, unfortunately. I have no more Saturdays. I'm usually not free. I'm not in town. If you saw my calendar, you would just blow it up. But if you can't make a Sunday, we can work around it. It's not ideal, but I have as many days as I can with this. Okay. All right. I booked 20 minutes per person.
Would you be willing to Skype?
I really don't want to Skype. There's a lot of value to having human Yeah, no, there's a lot of value to human interaction, unfortunately. Yeah, no, I think you have value. All right, anything else? Okay. All right, let's move on then. So last class. Yeah, Janice, go ahead.
Okay, so I don't know if you mentioned this before. I may be mixing up classes. So stuff like because, B/C,
That doesn't save any words.
That's right, we're not doing characters, we're doing words. Okay, you're right. Okay. What if you not put spaces in between words?
Don't do that, please, Lord God. Every year someone does that, and it's the most obnoxious thing in the world.
Okay.
They'll have an entire sentence as one word. They'll just staggered alt caps. No, please don't do that. It drives me crazy. And by the way, if you do blow the word limit, I stop reading. If you go over the word limit, I stop at word 1,000. So usually someone who gets a very bad grade, ignore the word limit, and I just didn't read their last question. I do my own word count. The software tells me when you hit 1,000 words, so I know. So
You know, some of the exams you gave us, the word count was over.
So actually,
He went in and had it.
so let me just address that. This is an ongoing issue. In the past, no, it didn't actually. So in the past, my exams, I would give the A+ answer. That is, I plucked a single paper from the highest scoring student. Okay? Last year, I changed it. I made a composite hybrid A+ answer, where I took the highest scoring part from each of the different papers. So whoever scored the highest in part 1, part 2, part 3, so it's like a mutant answer. So the upshot is it's perfect, right? Everything's correct. Because some people will do great on part 1 and blow part 5, and I'm giving part 5 as a model. So the upshot is each of the parts was a 10. 10, 10, 10, 10, 10, 50. No one person got a 50, but collectively they do. The downside is people allocate the words differently. And the result is it goes over 1,000 words, which, again, I had people complain about this last year. They said, I can't do 1,000 words. You can do it. It's fine.
It's all over rate my professor. It's like,
I don't check. I do not check that website. I find that website is people have grievances. People are angry.
for you, it's the word limit. Totally, that's it.
Yeah, I haven't checked that website in 7 years. I haven't looked at it in 7 years, so I'm sure it exists. I actually post my own evaluations. My actual evaluations are online.
Really?
Yeah. So the actual evaluations, people, who actually are in my class, not, just random people who don't like me.
I mean, like you, it's just the word count.
Yeah, I don't care. What else? What else? Yeah, Justin.
Can I ask a question about the 13th Amendment?
I would love you to ask me a question on the 13th Amendment. Oh, is that Kanye West? Oh, God.
No, I don't know.
Oh, God. Oh, God. Thank you. Okay.
I don't know, but I was reading this thinking about how they left it legal to enslave people for crimes.
That's actually what Kanye was tweeting about. Oh, God. I didn't.
So I got to looking a little bit of stuff up, and it seems that prison reform started at the same time this happened.
That's what Ye was getting at. Yeah.
You have repeat offender laws, and there's like
yeah.
all kinds of arguments. And why did they leave that in there?
Okay, I can do this quickly. All right. Well, let me jump a little bit ahead, but I'll come back to your question more earnestly. The 13th Amendment. I'm going to skip the poll. We don't have time for the poll, and I'll do it in a minute. Okay. The 13th Amendment says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as a punishment for a crime, where the party shall have been duly convicted. Right. So just think about that for a minute. People who go to prison lose a lot of their liberties. They're held in captivity. They're told where they can go, what they can do. They're basically held in bondage. Sometimes they often have chains on them. I found a way to connect this for my lecture. If the 13th Amendment didn't include this clause, right, this middle clause, then every person who's held in bondage as a prisoner could claim that they're being held as a slave and that their captivity is unconstitutional. Right? Right? Literally, you're being held to the land in chains. That looks a heck of a lot like slavery. So the clause then says, except where a person's been duly convicted for a crime, which means you've been given due process and you've been convicted. Now, the reason why this became important later is you had a lot of states start playing funny business with this. So there's a concept called sharecropping, which generally means a person leases land from someone on some sort of short-term basis, farms it, and then gives a cut of the proceeds to whoever owns the land. A number of states enacted laws that said failure to comply with your contract is actually a crime. So basically, if you were in breach of your contract, your land contract, you were now a criminal. And guess what the punishment was for the crime? Hard labor, servitude. So a lot of people who are liberated by the 13th Amendment basically got put back in a state of quasi-slavery by virtue of the fact they breached their land contracts and were being held in violation of the laws. And there's a case in your book, I don't assign it, Bailey versus Alabama. It's in the 13th Amendment unit. I skipped it, but like last month. But that actually discusses laws that criminalize people. Oh no, it comes later this semester. Bailey versus Alabama. It's about laws that criminalize people who violate these land contracts. So that wasn't the intent, but a lot of states started messing with this punishment for crime clause to get around the slavery issue and basically reimpose it in a limited sense.
Jim Crow laws, weren't they enacted right after that? So couldn't it be argued that this was just like legal slavery targeting?
It was.
Black people?
It was. It was. It wasn't. It didn't have the same permanence, but it had the same effect. Yeah.
So I read it's a multi-billion-dollar industry, and the max wage for a prisoner is about 20 cents an hour.
Yeah, there's a documentary.
I think we may have read the same thing.
Yeah.
I thought about it, I was like, oh, it still has it. It's abused.
Yeah. Well. Yeah. Yeah. Can I?
Prisoners like, sorry, I know that sounds terrible, but like some of the jobs.
Just one at a time. Just one at a time, please. All right. Yeah.
Some of the prisoners, I mean, because they all have jobs in the prison, so it's like some of the jobs they like they get to go out to like a dairy farm and they get to be outside of the prison.
Guys, just one at a time. One at a time.
So
No,
like,
it's-
I mean, they all have duties inside the jail or outside the jail. They all have to conduct something. I'm not defending it either way. I'm just saying that they're.
Well, let me bring it back a little bit. So just one at a time, please. I have one rule. Just one person talks at a time. If you want to talk, just put your hand up, please. The issue of the treatment of prisoners is a serious question. When you're talking about wages, for example, or conditions, or even the restoration of civil rights, a person who's convicted loses certain rights for some periods of times or perhaps indefinitely. The franchise, for example, the right to vote. Certain types of crimes, you're limited your access to the internet, limited access to go online. Other types of crimes, you're limited the right to bear arms, even if your offense was nonviolent. So the rights of prisoners is a serious issue. I don't know if our class even has. I took a class on what's called habeas corpus, which is basically prisoner relief. And I don't know if South Texas has something like that, but definitely try to squeeze it in your upper levels if you can. But I want to do my quiz if I can. Anyone else in this? All right, so let's do a question, right, which I think actually blends into what we're talking about here. So here's my question. The framers of the 13th, 14th, and 15th Amendments intended those provisions to protect the freedmen. And when I say freedmen, I mean the freed slaves. And it actually meant men, as in men. And we'll get to that point later with Bradwell. What the hell is this? Whose is this? Rechargeable pet hair clipper? What the hell is this? Did someone give this to me? For me? I don't need that. I have a short-haired dachshund. There's no trimming needs. All right, question, focus, please. Today's not a good focus day. Another 10 seconds. People haven't voted in yet. All right. Who's up? I don't know. I have no idea who's next. Danny, or is that?
I'm only going by the word of others, but it might not be me.
No, I went last.
think it was me.
He was going this way, I went, and so.
Danny, you're next.
So you are.
All right, Danny. Okay, Danny, you're up. Thank you. Shh. Okay, settle. Okay, let's try and get a good rhythm for the rest of the class. Makes no difference who you are. Okay, so I couldn't care less who any of you are. Makes no difference to me. So, Danny, here's my question for you. Do we know what the intent of the Reconstruction Amendments 13, 14, and 15 was? Do you know what the intent was?
Not with 100% certainty.
Well, how would we figure out the intent of these amendments?
You would look at any notes that they made during the ratification process.
Who's they? The people who wrote it. Do the authors ratify the amendments? How's an amendment ratified, Danny? By the states? By who in the states? No? No? Carrie, how's an amendment ratified? Go to Article 5 of your Constitution. Haven't looked in a while. How is amendment ratified? Carrie? Walk me through the process. It's a several-step process. How is an amendment ratified?
Okay, 2/3 of the several states. Convention proposes amendments.
Someone watching us on YouTube just put the answer in. You guys be embarrassed. I actually see comments. People comment on YouTube. It's really funny. How is an amendment ratified, Carrie? Other people watch my lectures, not just you.
Well, they should be in class.
No, not students. Random people.
They should get a life.
No, I disagree. This is a public service. Carrie, what's the process for ratifying an amendment to the Constitution? Marcus? What's the process for ratifying an amendment to the Constitution?
Proposition by member of Congress.
Well, look at Article 5. It's right there. It's a very short passage. Anyone else? Who knows?
So either like it's the 2/3 of Congress and 2/3 of the Senate, and then they send it to the state legislatures, and then it's 3/4 of the state legislatures.
Is it the state legislatures?
When we discussed it.
Janice?
3/4 of several states, and then.
But who in the states?
The legislatures.
Not the legislatures.
When ratified by the legislatures of 3/4 of several states or by convention.
Conventions.
3/4 thereof.
Okay. So there are a lot of people involved. I'll come back to Carrie. Carrie, there are a lot of people involved in the ratification process, right? There's the House. There's the Senate. There's the state legislatures. There are state conventions. Okay? There are a lot of people involved, right? House, Senate, state legislatures are people in the conventions. How are we supposed to figure out the intent behind an amendment if you have lots of people with different walks of life voting on the same text? How are we supposed to know what the intent of an amendment is?
They kind of take what's going on during that time.
And what if people don't agree? You know, you have debates over amendments, wording. Not everyone agrees. How are we supposed to figure out the intent behind an amendment? You hear the phrase framers' intent, right? What do the framers intend? Framers don't always agree. We studied a very early example at the Bank of the United States, right? Hamilton thought the Bank of the United States was okay. Madison, Jefferson said it wasn't. Was Madison any smarter than Hamilton? These are pretty influential people in our founding. The same sort of debates about the Constitution existed in the 1860s, which I've described as our second founding. So again, my question then for Marcus is this. How are you supposed to understand the intent of an amendment if you have all these different people voting on it from different walks of life?
I guess by what it, the purpose of the, or what the goals of the.
But how do you know what those goals are, my friend? Okay, let's read it, right? 13th Amendment, let's read it. It's on the board, right? It says, I'll read it to you. Oh, sorry, I'll scroll, thank you. Right, I'll read it for you. It says, neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as the punishment for a crime wherever the party shall be duly convicted, shall exist within the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. All right, Marcus. What's the intent behind this provision?
To ensure that no one is ever enslaved again.
Okay, what does it mean to be enslaved?
To be put to service against your will, involuntarily.
Is that it? Is that all slavery is?
No, that's not all slavery. There's other forms of slavery. There's indentured servitude.
But only involves physical captivity.
No, it involves mental captivity. It involves financial captivity.
How do you know that, though?
I assume.
All right, so let's try another one. Kristen, let's go to the 14th Amendment, right? It says, no state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. What's the intent behind this provision, Kristen?
Basically to award the privileges and immunities of the United States to people the framers deemed to be citizens.
Okay, very good. And how do we know what these privileges or immunities are, Kristen? How are we supposed to know?
By knowing the framers' intent.
Yes, that's the question, right? But how do you know what their intent is? Oh, I know, I'm killing you, right?
You're killing me. I guess, well, no, because that's interpretation. I don't know.
All right, so let me take a step back. It's an unfair question because I don't think there's an answer to it. What I would probably say with this one is that it's false. That'd be my explanation, and let me explain why I think the answer is false. To the extent that there was any sort of overriding purpose behind the Reconstruction Amendment, it wasn't just about correcting the situation of the freedmen. It was a recognition that the first 100 years of the Republic didn't quite work out in terms of the relationship between the state and the federal governments. Right? It was a recognition that Congress would have to take a bigger role in how our republic operates than was done under the original design. Under the original Constitution, the states had almost no limitations put on it by the Constitution. States could do pretty much whatever they wanted. That was understood to be a mistake. So the 13th and 14th Amendments, and 15th Amendment concerned the right to vote as well. We'll get there probably a little bit later. But at least the 13th and 14th Amendments were meant to correct an imbalance where the states perhaps had too much power. Beyond that, it's hard to say what they intended because there were so many different people involved. Okay? The 13th Amendment was ratified in 1865, and the 14th Amendment was ratified in 1868. So let me walk through these a little bit. When I say neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, Sergio, does that suggest that slavery and involuntary servitude are the same thing?
No.
What does that suggest? You put them right back to back like that. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude. What does that suggest?
That they're two different things.
Yeah. Yeah, that they're different, right? Otherwise, they'd be surplus. So, is slavery broader, Sergio, more narrow than involuntary servitude? What do you think? Probably broader. That'd be my guess. Now, this comes up a little bit in Slaughterhouse. But there was a fairly wide understanding that the term slavery didn't merely refer to involuntary servitude, which basically means working against your will. It had a greater sense to it. Slavery would often be described as an institution. And this phrase institution doesn't have the same sort of meaning today as it once did, but it refers to generally a way of life, a way things operate. And there was a large sense at the time that slavery was not merely limited to the chattel ownership or the chattel servitude, but it also reflected what were called badges or incidents of slavery. Badges or incidents of slavery. Okay? Now, I think Monique said this a couple minutes ago. Shortly after the conclusion of the Civil War, the black codes, Jim Crow, started popping up throughout the former Confederate states. And the purpose of these laws was to reimpose forms of slavery without calling it that. So Justin asked about the involuntary servitude bit with the indentured servants, right? There was a fairly wide understanding that slavery was not just limited to laws that put someone in chains, but also deprive a person of certain civil rights on account of the previous condition of servitude, that is, their skin color. And slavery was generally understood to refer to some of these badges and incidents of slavery. That is, things that bring you back to that state before the war, even if it's not in the same name. Okay? And how do I know this? Now, I'm not just making this up, right? Blackman's just talking here, right? In the 1860s, Congress was very active. The first major act following the Civil War was the enactment of the 13th Amendment. That was ratified very quickly. And immediately, it had the effect of emancipating all the slaves. Immediately. The 13th Amendment did what Abraham Lincoln could not with the Emancipation Proclamation. If you recall, that only affected certain territories and people who joined the army. There were certain restrictions, right? The effect of the 13th Amendment was to emancipate the slaves immediately. But that wasn't the end. It's not just like, okay, you guys are free, move on with it, right? Congress added Section 2 to the 13th Amendment. This is a very important provision. It gave Congress a new authority, a new enumerated power. Just FYI, so far all of our enumerated powers has been in Article 1. No longer. We now have this new enumerated power called Section 2 of the 13th Amendment. And it says, Congress shall have power to enforce this article by appropriate legislation. Just pause for a minute to think what that means. Congress has the power to enforce this article, that is the 13th Amendment, that's what the article refers to, Section 1, by appropriate legislation. What does that mean? If someone is engaging in enslaving someone, right? If someone is creating conditions of slavery, Congress can take an action to criminalize it or perhaps create a civil cause of action for a lawsuit in court, right? But the framers of the 13th Amendment didn't stop there. Shortly after the ratification of the 13th Amendment, they enacted two very important pieces of legislation. These were really important. The first was the Civil Rights Act of 1866. The Civil Rights Act of 1866. And please watch the video. The video goes through this in much more detail than I can do today, but watch the video. The Civil Rights Act of 1866 guaranteed certain rights to the freedmen. the right to make and enforce contracts, the right to bear arms, the right to own property, etc. Now, wait a minute. We always ask, did Congress have the enumerated power to pass this law? Right? Was this a regulation of commerce? Not really. The only basis that Congress could enact the Civil Rights Act of '66 was by Section 2. What does that tell us? Those statutes did not merely eradicate chattel slavery. That statute went beyond and guaranteed certain rights from being deprived to the freedmen. Everyone understand what I'm saying, right? The framers of the Civil Rights Act of '66 thought that the 13th Amendment gave them the power to not only eradicate slavery, but eradicate the incidence of inequality that pervaded the black codes. For example, that people couldn't own property, or they couldn't make contracts, or they couldn't give testimony in court, or they couldn't bear arms. Right? Everyone just with me, understand what I'm saying? So at least the framers of the Civil Rights Act of '66 thought that the concept of slavery was broader than mere involuntary servitude, than mere chattel slavery. Now, not everyone agreed at this. At the time, the Congress was controlled by the radical Republicans. And the Republicans passed this bill. President Andrew Johnson, who came into office after Lincoln was assassinated, was a Tennessee Democrat who opposed Reconstruction. And he vetoed the Civil Rights Act of '66. But he argued that it was unconstitutional. He argued that Congress did not have the power to protect these civil rights for the freedmen, that they lacked that power, that the 13th Amendment was not adequate by itself to protect these rights. Everyone with me? And he may have been right, I don't know. But in response, Congress responded with a new amendment. They proposed what became known as the 14th Amendment. The 14th Amendment was designed at a minimum to ensure that Congress could enact these sorts of civil rights acts. Because the fear was this: once the southern states came back into the fold, they would repeal the civil rights statutes. And the purpose of the 14th Amendment, to the extent there was a purpose, was to make permanent the sorts of changes affected by the Civil Rights Act of '66. And also the Freedmen's Bureau Act, which I think is talked about in the video. So we go down to the 14th Amendment, right? And there's a lot of stuff going on here. In fact, basically the rest of the semester, from here till basically November, we're doing just 14th Amendment. And the 14th Amendment has a lot of stuff going on. And I talked about some of this last week. Section 1 of the 14th Amendment has 4 parts. So just keep it straight. 14th Amendment, Section 1 has 4 parts. Okay? The first part is called the Citizenship Clause. And it says, all persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. This was meant to reverse Dred Scott in a sentence. Dred Scott said certain people are never going to be citizens of the United States or of their own state. It doesn't matter what the state says. This provision said otherwise. If you were born here, or if you were naturalized, if you were born elsewhere and you're naturalized pursuant to Congress's laws, then you're a citizen of the United States and of the citizen of the state wherein you reside. This was a huge distinction, because now you basically made citizens the entirety of the freedmen. There was no question that they were citizens, and by the way, no question they can get into federal court under diversity of citizenship. That was a huge issue in Dred Scott, which turned them away from the courts. Okay, any questions so far? Okay, then we go down. Second, the Privileges or Immunities Clause. Now let me jump down a bit back to Article 4. Right? We discussed this provision last week. Article 4, Section 2, the Privileges and Immunities Clause. Here's how you keep it straight. In Article 4, it's privileges and immunities. In the 14th Amendment, it's privileges or immunities. How do you keep them straight? A and comes before O, or. Article 4 privileges and immunities, 14th Amendment or immunities. Why are they different? It's actually just grammar. Right? It says the citizens of each state shall be entitled to privileges and immunities, whereas here it's in the negative. Right? No state shall make or enforce any law, privileges, or immunities. It's just a grammar thing. There's nothing more to it. I've looked into this. It's the best I can come up with. So Article 4 says the citizens of each state shall be entitled to privileges and immunities of the citizens in the several states. What does that mean? You have these rights, these privileges and immunities. If someone comes to your state, say a citizen of New York travels to New Jersey cannot discriminate against the out-of-stater, right? New Jersey must afford the out-of-stater the same rights it gives to its own citizens. That's great. But what if you're not a citizen of your own state? Now we fix that. We fix that. Because the 14th Amendment says that everyone is a citizen of the state they reside. So now we have this new provision. No state shall make or enforce any law which shall abridge the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. So this puts a limitation on the state's power. Before this, states could pass pretty much whatever law they wanted. Now they can't. Now they can't. They can't pass a law that abridges the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States. Now, what does that mean? What are... Oh, sorry, Marcus?
Maybe think of Jim Crow laws.
More?
Well, they can no longer. This was in 1868. So how then were Jim Crow laws? Well, they were policies. They weren't actual.
Oh, they were laws. They were laws. Well, the answer is Slaughterhouse. The answer is Slaughterhouse. And Crookshank as well, which I think was in your reading for today as well. But the phrase privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States, what does that mean? Now, this is discussed in the video, but there's a very famous case decided early in the Republic called Corfield versus Coryell. Corfield versus Coryell. And it wasn't a Supreme Court decision. It was probably the most famous non-Supreme Court decision you'll ever read. It was decided by Justice Bushrod Washington. What a name. I love his name. Bushrod Washington was George Washington's nephew. George Washington put his nephew in the Supreme Court. You know, isn't that cool? Qualified though, very good judge, very good judge. And Corfield versus Coryell was a case from a circuit court in Pennsylvania, or was it Connecticut? I'm drawing a blank. All right. And in that case, Justice Washington said that there's certain privileges and immunities that are so fundamental. The right to make contract, the right to own property. He had this list of various rights. And many of the framers of the 14th Amendment read Justice Washington's list when they were proposing this new clause. But then we get to the Slaughterhouse Cases, which read it a little bit differently. They said that this clause didn't refer to these old natural rights, but instead it referred to these new things, privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. That is, federal rights. In a bizarre way, they adopted Taney's reading that there's a distinction between states' rights and federal rights. This was from Dred Scott, you might recall. So the Slaughterhouse Cases basically killed PRI, privileges or immunities. We'll get there later in class. But this was supposed to be the crown jewel of the 14th Amendment. This is, to Marcus's question, this is a provision that was designed to prevent states from enacting laws to deprive people of rights. This was it. It even says it. No state shall make or enforce any law. It's a limit on the state's lawmaking power. This was the provision that was meant to protect states from enacting discriminatory laws. Did not work. I'm sorry, what?
I was going to say, so wasn't the Jim Crow laws, they weren't abolished until the Civil Rights Act of 1964.
And then a couple of years.
Right. Okay.
Yeah. Let me make this point very bluntly. The Slaughterhouse case came up in a fairly mundane context, right? Can the butchers have this monopoly, right? It was almost like a silly case. It was such an important decision. Bradwell as well, but that was sort of like the follow-up. But the Slaughterhouse case was such an important decision. If you read the dissent by Justice Field, if that had been the majority position, then a lot of Southern laws that were discriminatory would not have stood. But what did the court say in Slaughterhouse? We are not a censor, right? We do not want to serve as a censor of state legislation. So Slaughterhouse was probably, I can't overstate how important it is, but it was a very important case you've never heard of. That basically gutted the 14th Amendment from having any teeth. Long before you had Plessy and separate but equal, right? Long before you had the civil rights case, which we'll study in a week or two, you had Slaughterhouse. Yeah, Janice?
Okay, so you said that the 14th Amendment limited the state's power to make laws that discriminated against individuals, all individuals, not just as what.
It says citizens.
Okay.
And now we know that everyone born here is a citizen.
Okay.
Yeah. Notice it doesn't say persons, it says citizens. Because citizens were understood to have certain rights that people do not. Because you give me an alien, for example, who doesn't have the same sorts of rights. Are everyone with me? So anyway, the Slaughterhouse case, which we'll cover, was a huge decision, very significant. Then we go down to number 3, right? This is what's called the Due Process Clause. We already have a Due Process Clause in the Fifth Amendment that says that the federal government can't deprive a person of life, liberty, or property within the due process of laws. But that only controlled the federal government. Now, states were required to give people the due process of law before taking away their life, liberty, or property. Now, generally, this was a provision thought to refer to the courts. That is, if the courts want to take something away from you, they have to give you a proper hearing. But there's also a fairly significant thread of thought that this also applies to the legislature, right? That the legislature can't simply enact a statute that says you take all of your property away. Now, whether it violate privileges or immunities, or whether it violate due process, maybe both. But this is another provision that limits the power of the state to deprive people of their property and liberty. Now, what is liberty? We will spend a couple weeks on that question, right? I think I gave you a parable that I think it was attributed to Lincoln, that if you have a sheep and you have a wolf, and I'm the shepherd, right? The wolf says, why are you stopping me from eating? I'm hungry, right? He thinks I'm a tyrant. And the sheep says, no, you're my liberator, right? You're keeping me safe from these animals, these wolves. So depending where you sit, your definition of liberty might vary. Okay, the last provision in Section 1 is what's called the Equal Protection Clause. And this is probably the most famous provision that people are aware of. It says, nor shall any state deny to any person within its jurisdiction the equal protection of the laws. And under modern doctrine, at least how the courts interpret it the last, 100 years or so, this provision means that the law must apply equally to people regardless of their race, for example. That a black person and a white person, the law also applies to them equally. You can't have separate but equal. That's modern doctrine. That's not how this provision was understood. The key word there is protection. Protection. Protection from what? Violence. One of the first laws passed by the Reconstruction Congress was the Ku Klux Klan Act, which you might know better as Section 1983. Did you say in Section 1983? No?
Yes.
In Civ Pro, maybe? Torts. So Section 1983 is if someone acting under the color of state law deprives you of civil rights, you can sue them in federal court, right? That was, we call it Section 1983 today, but it was originally enacted as a Ku Klux Klan Act, right? You might think of the Klan as a private group, but these were government officials in many cases doing lynchings. So what this provision did was that if someone engages in these acts of violence against you and deprives you of civil rights, the government of the United States will protect you. And you go to court and sue them. But also you had federal law enforcement officials actually charging these lynch mobs with federal crimes. This is what Crookshank was, right? Crookshank was a case where you had this massacre, the Colfax massacre of these people in this courthouse who were burned to death. And the federal government came in and tried to prosecute them for not protecting their own people. So the Equal Protection Clause was, again, designed at protection. That's the key word, protection of their own people. Now, you have all these great provisions in Section 1, but let's be very blunt here. Congress did not trust the states to guarantee these rights. No way. Wasn't going to happen. So they added a very important provision. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Section 5 of the 14th Amendment. Now, we've discussed Section 5 already. When we did Bernie v. Flores, and when we did Hibbs, right? We discussed Section 5 in the context where Congress can waive or abrogate a state's sovereign immunity. Remember this? You should be familiar with it. Exams come up real soon. Right? That Congress can waive or abrogate a state's sovereign immunity. That was a legislation that may or may not be appropriate. And the court found that the law in Bernie was unconstitutional, but the law in Hibbs was valid. But the general gist of Section 5 is it gives Congress the power to intervene if a state is denying someone certain rights. So if a state is not providing equal protection in the laws, Congress can pass a statute. That was the Ku Klux Klan Act, 1983. If a state was depriving their citizens of privileges and immunities, Congress can intervene and pass the law providing a cause of action in federal court. If a state is depriving someone of due process of law, then Congress can intervene with a federal prosecution or perhaps even enacting a statute. Okay? We'll cover Section 5, I think, next class, maybe the class after, with the civil rights cases. I can't remember which class that's in. I think it's maybe next class. Okay, so we'll do Section 5 later. But the cases today, Slaughterhouse and Bradwell, were not applications of Section 5. These were applications of Section 1. And the question there was presented. Was the Louisiana butcher law a violation of the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States? And was a restriction on women entering the bar in Illinois a deprivation of the privileges and immunities of citizens of the United States? In the third case today, Crookshank, this is a slightly different question. Right? The question there was this. Were state officials violating people of their rights? And could Congress enact a statute that allows their prosecution? This was a criminal prosecution, right? Bradwell and Slaughterhouse were challenging state statutes. The third case was actually a criminal prosecution of individuals who engaged in this massacre for violating the rights of the freedmen. All right, so any question? That was a condensed summary of a lot of stuff. Please go watch the videos, one on the history of the 13th and 14th Amendments and the privileges or immunities video. They will be much more helpful than me. Or not, I don't know. All right, any questions? Are you next or who's next? Did I call on you? You did. All right, Clay. Clay, give me the facts, please, in Slaughterhouse Cases. And by the way, it's called the Slaughterhouse Cases, plural, because there are a lot of different cases that were sort of consolidated. That's why it's called the cases.
Okay, so it was in New Orleans, as I recall.
New Orleans, yeah.
And the state had passed a statute on butchers.
Okay.
That they do their slaughtering at a specific place within the city.
Okay, and what was the effect of that statute to butchers who have their own shops?
They couldn't give them a monopoly.
Yeah. And let me just give some facts here, right? I've actually learned this recently. I don't think I mentioned this last year. Today we have the idea of, health inspections, right? Health inspections. Food safety, right? Clean conditions in butcher shops. That didn't exist in the 1870s. That was not a thing. And there was a new movement to try to have a single location to slaughter animals to prevent the spread of disease, infection. Also, they would often dump whatever crap that comes out of an animal into the river, the Mississippi. And that was not a good way of having a river filled with all this pollution. So there were reasons why the slaughterhouse was built to prevent pollution. Now, one company was given a monopoly to run the slaughterhouse. Now, I learned this actually about a week or two ago. I didn't know this before. The reason why this one company was given a monopoly is that they paid for the slaughterhouse. The government didn't want to raise taxes to build this. So instead of raising taxes to build a government slaughterhouse, they said, okay, you build out of your own funds and we'll give you this monopoly for however many years. That was the reason why there was a monopoly, right? One company would have all the slaughtering needs for the entire city. Right? That was the basis. Now, Janice, why were the butchers so upset about the establishment of this monopoly?
Because they felt like it was impeding them from their trade, basically, from being able to slaughter wherever they wanted to slaughter, that they can only slaughter in this one location.
Well, I mean, it's nice that they were annoyed that their trade was being obstructed, but what was their constitutional argument, Janice?
So their constitutional argument was that it violated the right to practice their trade.
Ah. So, yeah, you're right. Keep going. Keep going.
Okay.
Sorry, cough drop.
The restrictions created involuntary servitude, according to them, and deprived them of their property rights without due process of law, and it denied them equal protection of the laws and abridged their privileges and immunities as citizens.
Okay, very good.
The 14th Amendment for them.
They threw the entire kitchen sink, didn't they? They said that the law that forces them to use this monopoly slaughterhouse was an effect of slavery. That argument didn't go too far. But they also argued, and this is a primary argument, that the law violated the privileges and immunities of citizens. So the question is this, right? What are the privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States? The butchers argued that includes a right of contract. Now, what does this mean, right of contract, right? It means if I want to have my own profession, my own trade, I have a right to earn an honest living, right? I have a right to pursue my own calling, subject only to reasonable regulations, I suppose. And their complaint was, we don't mind health and safety inspections, but you can't give one company a monopoly. If you want to say that we have to keep our shops clean, that's fine. But you can't tell us we have to give up our own slaughterhouses and give a business to this one company, right? Who are they? Who are they to have this monopoly? And his argument was not without merit. If you look at the precursor to the 14th Amendment, which is the Civil Rights Act of 1866, that is, there was a very strong discussion of rights of contract, that people can make their own contractual arrangements. Mia, what does the Slaughterhouse Majority by Justice Miller say about the meaning of the Privileges and Immunities Clause, or Immunities Clause, I'm sorry?
They take very interesting reading of Citizens of the United States.
Okay.
And say that the clause only protects the privileges or immunities that are given to the citizens of the United States.
Okay.
And there was purpose in that phrasing, especially juxtaposed to the previous clause. And so they say that they go and they look at what the citizens in the several states like they look at Article 4, Section 2, and they bring up Corfield versus Coriel. And they say, like in your video, they talk about the broader consequence of, did you want me to discuss the privileges and immunities
Go for it.
of the states? So those are the fundamental rights that are basically inherent in the individual. And it's a give and a take, the protected rights. And then there are also restraints, basically like the social compact. But possession of property of every kind, pursuing obtain happiness and safety. But they said that if you read it as intended to be that, then they're saying that basically the walls of federalism would crumble, and that would be where the court would be a perpetual censor on all state legislation, and that the federal government essentially assumed what was essentially this state function. And all of this, they said that discretionary power to limit states' exercise of legislative power in their ordinary and usual functions would be the result. And so there would be this broad overreach by the federal government on from the states, their right to protect the civil rights of their own citizens. And that is not what Congress intended.
Okay, very good. Lots of stuff in there. Let me unpack it one piece at a time. The court here was troubled, right? The court here, I think, was very nervous. If indeed the Privileges or Immunities Clause protected all these rights, and any time a state passed a law affecting these rights, what would happen? They'd run to court. This would give the court, they say, a perpetual censor over state legislation. If you've noticed, almost every case we've studied up until the 1860s involves federal law, right? Almost every case we studied involves some sort of federal law. The Fugitive Slave Act, the federal illegal tender bill, right? The Bank of the United States, right? All of the cases we've studied so far involve federal law. There were not many state law cases that are in our book up to this point. But now, whether or not Congress takes any action, the courts would have a license to perhaps set aside unconstitutional state laws. And the court said we can't have that, right? We can't have this radical transformation. Now, one thing that I learned this also fairly recently, there was a strong concern that the 14th Amendment was unconstitutional. Wait, what? What did he say? What did Blackman just say? The 14th Amendment was ratified under, shall we say, dubious circumstances, where a lot of states were given a condition: you either ratify this or you're not brought back into the Union, right? You don't get any representation in Congress till you ratify this amendment. And apparently there was a concern in the 1870s that the Supreme Court might strike down the 14th Amendment. What? Yeah, just follow me here. There was a concern that the Supreme Court might actually invalidate the 14th Amendment. And so the entire thing was not properly ratified. And the first major case that tested the 14th Amendment was Slaughterhouse. So in terms of degrees of screwing it up, right, and in terms of degrees of doing harm, this perhaps was not as bad as the court saying the 14th Amendment was not properly ratified. That would have been a really big deal. So this was almost okay, the amendment exists, but just doesn't really have a lot of weight to it. So what did the court hold? They say that the privileges or immunities refers not to these sort of natural rights that Justice Washington discussed in Corfield. It didn't discuss rights of contract and property and the like. Instead, it refers to a very narrow set of federal rights, right? That is, privileges or immunities of citizens of the United States. That's federal rights. For example, the right to come to the seat of government, to transact business, to engage in administering of its functions, free access to the seaports, access to the sub-treasuries, to have protection in the high seas, the right to use navigable waters of the United States, and blah, 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 right? almost all scholars, there are a couple on the other side, but virtually every scholar thinks that this is wrong. That a civil war was not fought to ensure people have protection in the high seas, right? That the 14th Amendment was not ratified at a significant cost to ensure that people can navigate the waters of the United States, right? If you look at almost every indication, this is my opinion now, so I'm going a little bit off the normal objective path, but if you look at almost every indication of how the framers of the 14th Amendment spoke about it, they were not talking about this bizarrely narrow subset of rights. That's not what they were talking about. They were ensuring that the states could only deprive people of these really important rights. Now, whether the exact boundaries of those rights, we can disagree. But this is wrong, right? Whatever privileges or immunities are, the things the court listed are not correct. Right? Maybe there's something else, but that's not right. But the bottom line, oh yeah, Drew?
Yeah, so while I was reading the case, I was thinking the same thing, just that you can say the 13th and the 14th Amendment were pretty much paid in blood, right?
Yeah,
war, right?
exactly.
So when I saw the courts, the way they were interpreting the 14th Amendment, and like you said, hey, it's there, but it doesn't mean much, right? Was this because it was just was there a Democrat majority in the Supreme Court at the time that was kind of backlashing now, we're back, and hey, I think Andrew Johnson was the president then, so did he have his appointees in there that were pushing back on the 14th Amendment?
I can't recall the political parties of those on the court at the time.
Pedia said that Miller was a liberal.
Yeah, I don't know, but my general, Drew's asking a good question, right? You have these amendments which were paid for in blood. I like the way you put that. They're paid for in blood. And you had a bloody civil war, brother against brother killing each other, right? Men dying on the battlefield. And then you get to this constitutional amendment that has such a significance, right? And then the Supreme Court says, yeah, it's just irrelevancy. Now, why? The best theory I heard is one I mentioned a minute ago, that there were strong doubts whether this thing was even constitutional in the first place. And this was their way of saying, well, we don't want to strike to the amendment, we'll just give it zero weight, right? We'll just give it not much significance. Now, I don't know which is worse, right? This, I think, might even be worse. People don't quite realize it. But the bottom line, what actually happens here is the justices don't want to get the role of the censor. They don't want to radically change the way the courts intervene in state legislation. And what you'll see in today's readings and the readings next week with the civil rights cases is the court actually holds unconstitutional federal laws designed to eliminate segregation. So did anyone read the civil rights cases yet? Yeah, I think is it for Wednesday or is it next week? I can't remember.
Wednesday.
Okay, yeah, I can never remember. So you're reading on Wednesday is a case called the Civil Rights Cases. And this involved a Civil Rights Act that Congress enacted that's in public accommodations, theaters and stuff, right? Hotels, inns, you can't segregate on skin color. The Supreme Court stepped in and said that's unconstitutional. So not only did the court give a narrow construction of the 14th Amendment, Section 1, they gave a narrow construction of Section 5, which gives Congress the power to enact these sorts of laws. So at every juncture from the 1870s on, with a few exceptions, the court narrowly read the 13th and 14th Amendments to eliminate the power of Congress to eradicate the vestiges and the remainders of slavery. Now, why they did that, I can write a book about that, right? There are a million and one reasons. But maybe one reason, and this is one I think becomes a little more obvious later, is the court had a recognition that if they started censoring state legislation, then people might not start following their judgments. And this is not a trivial concern. If a court orders, integrate that theater, right? Desegregate that school, and the people on the ground say, no, we're not going to do it. The court doesn't have an army, right? The court doesn't have, remember poor Chief Justice Taney, he sent his marshal to the fort, knock, knock, who's there? General, get lost, right? So the courts don't have an enforcing mechanism. And my own personal theory, and Drew, this is, I don't have an answer, my own theory is the court said that Reconstruction and integration is a very messy process. We don't want to be involved, right? Let the people figure this stuff out themselves. We don't want to be the ones to do this because it might impact the court's ability to operate. And there was one case decided in the early 1900s, what's it called, Giles, I think it's called Giles, where basically you had well, it's actually a grandfather clause, I'm summarizing, where the law said if you weren't able to vote by a certain a date, you can't vote. And of course, at that time, only white people could vote. So it basically cut off the franchise. And there was an opinion by Justice Holmes, if I recall. He basically said, well, this is bad, but for us to actually fix this, we have to be involved in local elections and monitoring it. And we really can't do that, so we're just going to let it go. And I think that's the most candid statement of why they sort of pulled back. So one second, Mia. So you wouldn't have until the 1950s, really in the 60s, the judiciary inserting itself back into this process. But even then, right, when the court said desegregate, it took decades to do it, if ever, right? It's still kind of ongoing. So Drew's question is very well put, but the court, I think, just did not want that responsibility, and they didn't want to be involved. Why? I could write a book about it, but that's my own pet theory. Mia, your hand was up a minute ago?
Yes, I was just going to ask, so because the majority just said that the 14th Amendment, if it was read the way that it's written, it would radically change the whole theory of the relations between the states and the federal government.
Yeah.
I mean, if people were saying that the war was about states' rights and states' rights lost, then the war radically changed the relations between the federal government and the states. I don't understand even from a historical context perspective.
And they were there.
Yeah.
And this one line was it's fresh in our minds, right? This is recent history, which is why when I asked this question about the intent of the amendments, even the men who were around at the time, who lived through this, who fought in the war, they had wildly different interpretations about what this thing meant. Justice Fields, for example, in the dissent, and the majority by Justice Miller, right? They had very different understandings of what this thing meant. But they did not want it. I think they didn't recognize how far. Now, I think that a lot of people didn't quite. They were called the radical Republicans. They were quite radical, and radical could be good or radical could be bad. But they were trying to change the structure of the federal government in the states. That I can say without many doubts, and not everyone agreed with that approach. Yaren?
You said that they maybe didn't want to read it the way that it was written because they were unsure if it was unconstitutional or not.
It's a theory. I don't put too much weight, but that's a theory I've read.
So I understood that in this case, like I didn't like it, but I understood it. But then when we get to the last case, I don't know how to say that.
Crookshank.
Yeah. They used that same thing to keep them from peacefully assembling. And they said in this case that was a right inferred. So is it just because then I know then they said, well, it's a interstate thing, so we can't. So I don't understand the difference, I guess is what I'm saying. How in here you say that it protects the rights to peacefully assemble, but when then they do peacefully assemble, it doesn't protect the rights. Is it just?
Let me just hold on to Crookshank until we get there. I promise. I'll get your question later. I don't want to, because we only have half an hour left. I want to make sure I have time for Bradwell as well. All right, but I think all of your questions, if I can, synthesize them, reflect the frustration that you have this major constitutional change, and then the span of a couple years, the Supreme Court says, no, it doesn't really do that much. Just kidding. It'll get worse next class and the class after. If you're angry now, just you wait. And again, every year I teach, I have a very similar reaction. But I think that the so-called radical Republicans perhaps got a little bit ahead of themselves and were doing stuff that other people in our society didn't quite want to go. And the Supreme Court pulled back in the reins. And by the time you get to the 1870s, the southern states had been readmitted to the Union, and they didn't have the same sort of majorities in Congress to sort of enact this legislation. So a lot of these bills that were passed were eventually declared unconstitutional. The Civil Rights Act of 1870 and others. Okay.
This wasn't really
I'm sorry, what was your question?
This was really federal versus state, not really the radical change of, interfering with state rights, or was it the subject matter?
Give me a little bit more. I think I know what you're getting at, but give me a little bit more.
To say, I hear what you're saying, that I could see where that could be a great rationale to be used to not enact, not ensure that the 14th Amendment, the fifth section.
Section 5.
Give Congress, allow Congress to have that broad power to ensure that the provisions are adhered to within the states. So I can see, that as a rationale for doing certain things that the court could use as a rationale. But like what Yadin was saying, when it comes to certain subjects, you're going to flip the rationale so that you're basically saying, you're basically going against what you said before in order to rationalize what it is now that.
You're talking about race.
And the bottom line comes down
Or like
to the
Bravo?
idea of just, the not wanting wanting slavery back, and you used a great word, the badges of slavery, to be consistent and not wanting to actually get involved from that perspective. So it's sort of like it's still it's sort of like like a demonstration against the whole civil rights of 1966, 66 or 65, and also of the 14th Amendment, and also of the Civil War, to keep things the same, but under the premise of, maintaining state sovereignty.
Ah, what a good point. Everyone understand her point. If I try and summarize, I'm sure I'll get it wrong. But I think Janice's point is a key issue here is not just about federalism, but also about race and a desire to maintain the subordination. Which is why Slaughterhouse was a strange case to come up first, right? I always ask myself this: why wasn't the first case about the 14th Amendment about a Jim Crow law? Right? Why was the first case that came to the court about the 14th Amendment about butchers? Who the hell cares about butchers, right? Why was it the butchers? I often ask, I don't know. Why is that the first case? Shouldn't the first case that came up one about, depriving freedmen the right to own property or something, or the freedmen the right to make contracts, or maybe the freedmen the right to give testimony in court, or the freedmen's right to serve on a jury or something, right? Why was the first case about butchers? Why was this a test case? And maybe one answer is it wasn't about race. That they were hoping, maybe, I don't know, that if the first case was not about race, you might get a better ruling. And then later, if the case about race might
It's already the precedent set.
that maybe, I don't know. I mean, that's a theory. I couldn't give you an answer.
It's a safe way to do it.
It's safe. I think she used a good word, right? It was a safe test case because it didn't involve slavery and Jim Crow. It involved butchers, which is fairly, who cares with the butchers?
But I thought they were able to use it as like a good kind of analogy on segregation already. When I was reading this case, I just felt like it was a kind of a roadmap and a red carpet to welcoming Jim Crow and welcoming like separate but equal. I thought they were able to build some of that framework.
Because if the states can pass legislation without a censor, then they can discriminate, right? If they can treat classes of butchers differently, they can treat classes of people differently. Maybe that. All right. So I think Noel's next. Noel, Justice Field briefly. What was Justice Field's argument in dissent?
So Justice Field basically.
And Field was a Lincoln nominee, if memory serves. Yeah, go ahead.
He basically made the point that ratifying these amendments would be useless, more or less, if that interpretation was taken, and that the meaning of the amendments was meant to be more broad and not as narrow as the holding. And he basically says that the majority basically turns the Privileges and Immunities Clause into oblivion.
Yeah.
And he also says that there are other important things like right to bear arms and the right to free speech that are involved here. And basically, he kind of basically makes a point that, and I don't think he said this, but the federal government's right to abrogate is reduced.
That's a good point, yeah. So let me try and synthesize some things Noel said. He's very correct. Justice Field says that if the 14th Amendment was limited to these sort of federal rights, it would be a vain and idle enactment. And he would say that the 14th Amendment refers to the natural and inalienable rights which belong to all citizens. And he references the Civil Rights Act of '66, which took the right to make and enforce contracts, to give evidence, purchase property, have the full equal benefit of the laws, proceedings, for security. He cites Corfield versus Coriel in Article 4. And he says that these monopolies, these grants of exclusive privileges are unconstitutional. Okay. But Justice Field was only in dissent. To this day, Slaughterhouse is still good law. There was a case decided in 2010, or was it 11? 10 or 11, blanking on the year, called McDonald v. Chicago. And this case asked whether the Second Amendment, the right to bear arms, applies to the states. Justice Thomas would have been willing to overrule Slaughterhouse and say it was wrong the day it was decided. He would also overrule Cruikshank. That position got a total of 1 vote, and the other 8 justices kind of ignored him. I wrote a lot of stuff about that case back in the day. But it's in your book. I used to assign it, but it's too long, so it's in your book already. McDonald v. Chicago. There's a lot of really good history about the Reconstruction era and the Privileges or Immunities Clause. If you want to read more, read Justice Thomas's concurring opinion, McDonald. It's not very long, but it's very good. All right, so any other questions on Slaughterhouse cases?
What does
I'm sorry, one at a time. Marcus, was your hand up?
Notes I made on Justice Fields says that he was kind of saying that the state shouldn't be able to encroach upon the rights of the citizens in the name of police power.
Yeah. Yeah. For Justice Field, the 14th Amendment contracted the scope of the state's police power, right? It shrank it. According to the majority, the 14th Amendment did nothing to the state's police power. It was only these very narrow federal rights, which I don't know how a state can deprive a person of protection in the high seas. What does it even mean, right? I don't. Pirates, if you actually think about what these rights are, they're basically worthless. Mia.
What does the Privileges or Immunities Clause do then? Like why?
Now?
No, I'm just saying in this. Oh, I guess. I mean, if this is still law.
Very little.
If we have Article 4, Section 2.
Article 4 only concerns discriminating against out-of-staters, right? Treating out-of-staters differently. Today, the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment includes something called a right to travel, which I don't even know where that came from. But it basically says that you can't be denied rights when you move to a state. So for example, I think California enacted a law that said if you move to California, you have to wait a certain period before you apply for welfare. And the court said that was unconstitutional because it violates the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment. That's about it. It doesn't really mean much more than that today. I just wrote a paper on 14th Amendment PRI, and that's about it. All right, so any other questions on Slaughterhouse? All right. The next case, Bradwell, was decided, I think, the following day. And I just want to just frame this case a little bit. When Bradwell was briefed, Slaughterhouse had not yet been decided, right? So if you're Myra Bradwell and you're her legal team, you don't know what Slaughterhouse is, hasn't been decided yet. All of her arguments, or at least most of them, were premised on the Privileges or Immunities Clause. She did not get a chance to actually brief the case knowing what the rule of decision was. Just think about this, right? You brief a case at first impression. They decide Slaughterhouse on Monday, and then on Tuesday they decide your case, and they don't give you a chance to re-argue it or rebrief it. So really, this case was fixed from the beginning, so to speak. All right? So Quinn, you want to give me the facts, please, in Bradwell?
So Myra Bradwell applied to the state bar
Huh?
to become an attorney.
Mm-hmm.
And basically that didn't really work out.
Well, give me a little bit more. Be a little bit more precise, please. Yada, 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 right? No, what? Yada, yada, she was denied, right?
Yeah, under laws of coverture.
Okay. What are the laws of coverture? Did you do this in property? Okay. What are the laws of coverture?
So like a married woman would be bound neither by her express contracts nor by those implied contracts, which it is the policy of the law to create between attorneys.
Okay. So basically, under the laws of coverture, a married woman no longer had a legal identity. It was subsumed, absorbed into legal fiction, that the marriage was its own legal person. As a consequence of that, married women could not make contracts. They weren't allowed to. Right? So the argument was this: how can you be a lawyer and a member of the bar if you can't make your own contracts with clients? So the Illinois bar turned her away. Now you might say, well, get rid of coverture, of course. But she was starting a little bit smaller. And Bradwell sought admission just for the state bar. And she apprenticed with her husband, who was a lawyer. All right, so Vincent, the majority opinion here is actually pretty short, right?
Yes.
Why is the majority opinion so short? The majority opinion, it's pretty brief.
Yeah, if I remember correctly, they basically say that the right to admission to a state bar is not included in any like privileges or immunities.
And how do they know that? What precedents do they then rely on to say that?
Oh yeah, they use the Slaughterhouse cases.
Duh, yeah, Slaughterhouse. Slaughterhouse had been decided the day before. So look, she's not accessing the sub-treasuries and was it high water navigation, whatever the heck it was, right? She's trying to be a member of the bar. So for the majority in Bradwell, it's actually pretty easy. Say, look, we just listed these 5 or 6 things, what the privileges or immunities are. This ain't one of them. So she's denied. But then you got the dissent. Or actually, I'm sorry, the concurring opinion here, right? Yeah, this one always gets it. Unfortunately, May's next, right? So the concurring opinion has a more difficult task. And the reason why is that just the day before, they were like, all these rights protected, rights of contract, rights of property. Okay. And here, the outcome turns a little differently. So walk me through the Justice Bradley concurring opinion.
Sure. So Justice Bradley, he basically said that, well, yes, there's the privilege and immunity clause. However, the privileges of a woman is different from men because by nature they're different creatures.
That's exactly right. Now, this is almost like a Dred Scott for women. I think the way but the way he describes it by nature reminds me of Tanya's opinion in Dred Scott. Same? Yeah.
Oh my God,
it's a bad 2 weeks for you.
But if you look at if you look at the clause, though, right? It doesn't say men of the United States; it says citizens, and then it says all persons born are citizens. So, as a textual matter, the opinion doesn't quite hold together, right? All persons are citizens, men and women. Therefore, all persons have these privileges and immunities. But he goes on this very long rant where he basically says that man is woman's protector, the natural and proper timidity and delicacy of female sex makes them unfit for civil life. The paramount destiny and mission of women are to fulfill the noble and benign offices of wife and mother. This is a law of the Creator. And the rules of civil society must be adapted to the general constitution of things. It cannot be based on exceptional cases. This is like Tawny for females. This is how I read whenever I teach this case. So, but he has to go all through these hoops to explain why the male butchers get rights of contract, but the female lawyer does not get a right of contract. I mean, that's why he has to go through all these hoops. I think Kanisha wasn't here today, but she asked me about why does Tawny go through all these hoops. I think he does the hoops the same way. He's got to really sell it, that why there's a distinction between these two things.
The difference, though, is, I mean, oh God, I can't believe I'm actually going to say anything positive about Tawny, but the difference is, at a minimum, at least he did pull
Something.
some law from
History, yeah.
somewhere, whereas he just goes on this tirade of this is what God ordained and make me a sandwich. I mean, basically.
There were some acrobatics, yeah.
Watch it. You're in trouble.
I mean, there's no law in
Here, if you need this to get him, you know. Yeah, I mean, there isn't law, but he's basically establishing this, and you'll see Justice Bradley's opinion cited in some of the gender discrimination cases later as like a thing of what not to do. So this, you'll come back to this later. I'll note briefly that Chief Justice Chase. Randy is a huge Chase fan. If you notice in our book, Chase looks very good. So he was a good guy. I think he was he was a good guy. He was a very good justice. But Justice Chase dissented in both Slaughterhouse and in Bradley. He was the only one who dissented in both. He didn't write an opinion. Marquia, go ahead.
I was wondering because I was like, this is Chase's court, and it just didn't seem like the Chief Justice would allow this kind of.
Whoa. What do you mean allow? Everyone gets one vote.
He seemed more, I don't know, I want to say like progressive and caring, I guess.
But the Chief Justice has but one vote. How can he tell people how to vote?
No, I'm not saying that, but it just seemed weird that this was under the time that he was Chief Justice, and then the extremes of the cases.
Yeah, in this case, he was out by himself.
Right.
And I think discussed this in the video, but he was quite ill. And he had a stroke. So he wasn't able to actually write an opinion in this decision. He's just going to do it. So, and I think it's unfortunate because you'll find this when there's a dissent, the majority has to respond to it. But when there's not a written dissent, the majority kind of just skate on their own. And I think this opinion would have benefited greatly from a dissent written, that they would have had to at least engage it a little bit, to at least embarrass the concurrence by Bradley.
I think they do it on their own.
Well, maybe not. I don't know. All right, so what happened afterwards? By the time Bradwell's case reached the court, though, the Illinois law was actually changed. And women were then admitted to the bar. So technically, the case was moot by the time it got to the court. The case was basically moot, but they still made this decision. Bradwell never actually applied for admission. She became a reporter, a legal journalist for the Chicago Legal Times. And eventually, she was admitted to the bar in 1890. And then in 1892, she was admitted to the U.S. Supreme Court bar on the motion of the United States Attorney General. We will discuss gender discrimination in about 2 or 3 weeks. What you're going to find, though, is that these cases are not premised on the Privileges or Immunities Clause. They're going to be premised on the Equal Protection Clause, which is where, after Slaughterhouse, right? Slaughterhouse basically killed the PRI clause. So the courts more or less did the same stuff through due process and equal protection, right? Whatever was meant to be done through PRI, they sort of shifted downstream, and they did it through due process or equal protection. So all the racial and gender discrimination cases under modern doctrine are equal protection cases. And cases about liberty, such as rights of contract, for example, were subsumed under the due process clause, the word liberty. So basically, pretend this one doesn't exist, but just quietly feed it into 3 and 4. Which is why, even though the courts screwed up on Slaughterhouse, they more or less got to the right place with the due process and PRI, equal protection. Not exactly, but they got to the right place for the wrong reason, if that makes sense, right? They more or less did what the 14th Amendment was designed to do, but not in the right way. I don't know. I don't know. I wish I knew. I wish I knew.
And not attack the.
But they did that later.
And not.
Because they didn't want to overturn Slaughterhouse. I don't know. I wish I could give you an answer.
It's odd. I mean,
Go read Justice Thomas's concurrence in McDonald, and he addresses this. He would basically jettison all due process law, all due process case law, and focus on PRI. So just read Justice Thomas's concurrence in McDonald. Mia.
So, is that kind of what they mean about settled law? Like Slaughterhouse is, like, even though it was decided wrong, they're not going to.
Yeah, and that was McDonald, right? And McDonald said, we don't want to overturn this precedent. It's 150 years old. We're not going to overturn it. Only Thomas was willing to reverse Slaughterhouse. Justice Thomas doesn't have a very strong conception of stare decisis. He would eliminate most precedents. You don't think it's like always, let's overturn the New Deal, let's overturn Slaughterhouse. He wants to overturn everything. Yeah, get rid of that. Basically, go back to the 1860s, right? Just wind it back. Yeah. Actually, maybe the 1930, maybe the early 1930s. I think you go back that far, at least. Stuff. Okay. We only have 10 minutes left, so let's do Crookshank. Kyle, can you give me the facts, please, on Crookshank?
Yeah. Thanks for picking me for this one. So,
I'm sorry. What? You're next.
Well, just because the facts are like a little bit ugly, but basically
They are ugly. It's yeah.
All right. So a Republican faction of African Americans, led by a local black militia leader, seized the local courthouse.
Okay.
Right. So essentially, they were all in this courthouse and they had armed. They were defending it, right? And
They were peaceably assembling, and they were also bearing arms. So just note those points.
And they were Union soldier weapons, right?
Yeah, they're old weapons from the Union Army. Yep.
And so this Klansmen, or I guess you could say, like, I don't think it specifically says they're Klansmen, but they're white.
It was a lynch mob.
There you go, lynch mob. So they want to obviously overcome the defenses of the courthouse and get them out of there. They're not able to do that, so they set the courthouse on fire. And as the people that are inside the courthouse are fleeing, they kill them. In various ways.
And they buried them in the river. Yeah, this is awful. I'm sorry, Kyle. That was very good of you to describe the facts, but this was an incident known as the Colfax Massacre. Colfax Massacre. It was atrocious. Basically, these people were burned alive. They were burned alive. Those who managed to escape were shot, and their bodies were dragged down to the river and dumped in the water. All right? Did the Louisiana government prosecute any of the people who perpetrated this fact? No, they did not. They didn't. Instead, the federal government stepped in. And they tried to prosecute them. But at the time, murder wasn't a federal offense. You think, why can't you just charge them with murder? Murder wasn't a federal offense in the same way it is today. What they could charge them with was depriving these individuals of their civil rights. Specifically, that these state officials, acting under the color of law, deprived these people in the courthouse of the rights to peaceably assemble, protected by the First Amendment, and the right to keep and bear arms, protected by the Second Amendment. Right? Had they deprived these people of the rights by burning them to death? I mean, it's almost like they did an awful thing and they were charged with something fairly minor. But that was what they could charge them with in federal court. They couldn't just bring a straight up conviction for arson.
Was Crookshanks a state official?
They were considered, yeah. They were considered basically acting under the color of state law. They use the phrase, they're not federal, they weren't state officials, but they're acting with the color of state law. It was like a government militia type thing. Yeah. So again, they couldn't charge them with arson, they couldn't charge them with straight up murder, but they charged them with depriving these individuals of their civil rights. So this raises the question, does the Privileges or Immunities Clause of the 14th Amendment include the provisions in the Bill of Rights, the first 8 amendments? Now, we studied Barron versus Baltimore the first week of class, and that case held that the Bill of Rights, first 8 amendments, does not apply to the states. Doesn't apply to the states. If the state wants to take someone's property, they can do it just fine. Did the 14th Amendment change that? Now, if you ask me, if you look at a lot of the speeches given by framers of the 14th Amendment, they argued that include the Bill of Rights. They wanted to reverse Barron. They say that now the states cannot deprive people of their rights in the Bill of Rights, first 8 amendments. So, Drew, what did the court hold in Crookshank?
That the First Amendment only protected against Congress infringement, not state infringement.
And what the Second Amendment?
Second Amendment, same thing.
Same.
Congress protection, but no, it doesn't protect against interference from the states.
Exactly right. The court holds here that the 14th Amendment's Privileges or Immunities Clause does not embrace the Bill of Rights. that states and state officials can deprive people of the right of assembly, peaceful assembly, and that state officials can deprive people of the right to keep and bear arms. So basically the murders of these individuals went unpunished because the court, again, narrowly read PRI. So let's look what happened, right? And I can summarize it because you almost have time. You have Slaughterhouse, you have Bradwell, and you have Cruikshank, right? You have these 3 cases decided in the span of like 3 years. What are privileges or immunities? Do they include the rights identified by Justice Washington and Corfield v. Coriel? Nope. Do they include the sorts of rights in the Civil Rights Act of '66? Nope. Do they include the provisions of the Bill of Rights, first 8 amendments? Nope. What do they include? Waters and sub-treasuries and access in the high seas, whatever the hell it was, right? And I say this almost with a bit of sarcasm in my tone, which you can sense. But in these 3 cases decided in the span of 3 years, they basically gutted, deleted, if you will, an amendment from the U.S. Constitution, a very important amendment. And the Colfax Massacre one, I think, was the worst of the 3 because you have text, right? Was the right of contract in there or not? I don't know. It's not written. But you have these amendments. There are 8 of them. And people said, yeah, we want these 8 amendments which apply to the federal government to now apply to the states. Now, fortunately, this was not the end of the line. Today, virtually every provision in the Bill of Rights applies to the states. But it's not done under the PRI clause. Instead, it's done under the Due Process Clause. And what the court has said is the word liberty here in the Due Process Clause includes provisions of the Bill of Rights. So states cannot deprive someone of one of these liberty interests, for example, the right of free speech, in violation of the 14th Amendment. In fact, there's a case this year, this term at the court, called TIMBS, T-I-M-B-S, which asks whether the 8th Amendment's prohibition on excessive fines, is incorporated to the states. There are very few cases left. Very few provisions of the Bill of Rights have not been incorporated. For example, the right of trial by jury is not incorporated. The right of a grand jury indictment has not been incorporated. The Third Amendment, quartering of troops, hasn't been incorporated. In the federal system, you have to have a unanimous jury conviction, but in the states, you have a non-unanimous criminal jury conviction. There are very few provisions that have not been incorporated. When I say incorporated, I mean extended to the states. It's a modern term. But we'll come back to the incorporation doctrine later. But again, what I want you to take away from this class is this. Between Slaughterhouse, Bradwell, and Cruikshank, you basically gutted PRI. It does include the privileges and immunities from Article 4. Doesn't include the Civil Rights Act of '66. Doesn't include the Bill of Rights. Okay. Questions? Questions? Yes, Marcus.
You been talking about what liberty refers to.
Which one?
Liberty. The word liberty in due process.
The court would later hold in the 1940s, 50s, and 60s that the word liberty includes the provisions of the Bill of Rights. And the provisions of the Bill of Rights actually are liberty interests that states cannot deprive you of. This is what became known as substantive due process. Substantive due process, the word liberty has a substance. Even though it talks about due process, procedural, it has substantive provisions, for example, free speech. Yaren?
So at this point, like 1875, the 14th Amendment basically means nothing.
Yeah, it means even less when you get to the civil rights cases a couple years later in 1780 or 1871 or so.
So we don't really use it until later on.
The 14th Amendment would not get any teeth until the 1950s.
Okay.
Yeah. In fact, when we did Ollie's Barbecue, Katzenbach and McClung, right? Remember we asked whether you could support the Civil Rights Act of 1966 based on Section 5 of the 14th Amendment, and only Justice Douglas said yes. Everyone else went to the Commerce Clause. So because the court killed the 14th Amendment, the Congress went to the Commerce Clause to expand the scope of federal power, even though it makes more sense to have a provision about race covering the Civil Rights Act. But we'll do this when we do the civil rights cases next week, or next class. I'm out of time. All right, come on up, Mikwa. Yeah. Go ahead.
What did you said, I just want to get the phrase right. Substantive what?
Substantive due process. All right, anything else? All right, I'll see you all in class on Wednesday. Thank you very much.